The sky above Navarreport was the color of dying embers, casting long shadows over the junkyard of old starships. It smelled like ozone, rust, and lost dreams. Traders haggled. Engines hissed steam. Scavengers moved between metal skeletons, whispering about salvage and quick credits. Amid this noisy mess walked Jace Rowen, a human, tall but unremarkable, dressed in a weathered jacket and boots with solace nearly gone. Jace, he had one goal today: buy something cheap that could fly. He wasn't a pilot by trade. He'd been a mechanic once, a good one. But life had a habit of breaking even the strongest bolts. Ever since the mining collapse on Cridden 4, he'd lost everything. His crew, his contracts, and the only thing. He couldn't repair his purpose. He walked past rows of broken hulls and burned-out cruisers until he saw it. A small freighter half buried under sand and cables. The seller, a gnarled Avaxi male with cracked tusks, waved lazily from a chair. "Engine still hums," the Avaxi grunted. "She's old, but quiet. Wants to be flown." Jace ran a hand along the surface. Rust flaked off. The ship was ugly, outdated, forgotten. But under his fingertips he felt something warm, not metal warm, but alive. He blinked. It was gone, probably his nerves again. He'd slept poorly, and the dreams had returned visions of fire, of a woman crying, of something calling him from the dark. "How much?" Jace asked quietly. 500 credits, the seller said, chewing something bitter. "And she's yours. No questions," Jace frowned. 500 was far too low, even for junk. But something tugged at him, a pull, quiet but heavy, like gravity on his chest. Against every logical thought, he paid the credits and stepped aboard. Inside, it was dust and silence. Wires hung from open panels. The lights flickered weakly. But the air was oddly clean. He moved slowly past the small cockpit, through a corridor lined with flickering monitors and faded warnings in alien text. There was an old bedroll, signs of recent movement. And then a sound. Faint, soft, a heartbeat. Or was it breathing? He turned sharply toward the rear cargo hold. Something was behind the sealed hatch. He could hear it now, the rustle of cloth. A quick breath held too long. The instinct to run clenched his gut. He reached for his sidearm. But then he heard a sound that froze him in place. A child's whimper. He opened the hatch slowly. Inside, huddled against the far wall, was a small alien child with grayish-blue skin and wide violet eyes. Beside her, an alien woman lay unconscious, her arms curled protectively around the girl. They had been hiding. For days, maybe longer. Jace stared. The girl stared back. No words, just fear. Her small fingers gripped the woman's coat. The human stepped back, mind racing. How had no one noticed them? Why was no one looking for them? And why, deep in his chest, did he feel something familiar in the girl's eyes? He could have turned them in. Could have walked out and told port security. But he didn single quotes t. Instead, he reached for the medkit and whispered, "I'm not here to hurt you." The child didn't answer. But her hand loosened its grip. Just a little somewhere far outside the ship, thunder cracked. But in the hold, silence grew between them. The kind that meant everything had just changed. The night on Navarreport came fast and heavy, like a curtain of steel. Jace sealed the ship's ramp and checked the locks twice. He had no idea what he had just walked into, but the silence behind that cargo hatch now felt like something alive waiting. Listening, he sat alone in the dimly lit cockpit, the ship groaning quietly beneath him. Outside, wind swept across the rusted fields of forgotten ships. Inside, there was only the hum of the backup generator and the quiet pulse of fear in his own chest. What had he done? He wasn't a hero. Not anymore. Once, maybe, back when he fixed ships for the Resistance on Lorwen Station. But those days ended when Command chose silence over saving lives. He walked away from that. And now, somehow, a child and a half dead. Alien women were hiding on a ship he had no business buying. He stood. Walked slowly back to the cargo hold. When the hatch opened, the child flinched again. She hadn't moved far. Her arms were now curled tightly around her mother's neck. Jace knelt, keeping his hands low and his voice soft. "She's still breathing," he said, glancing at the mother. "But her pulse is weak. Dehydration, maybe worse." He placed a canteen down beside them and unwrapped a sealed nutrient bar. The girl didn't move at first. Then, slowly, her eyes flicked to the food. She didn't take it, not yet. But she didn't push it away either. A small sign. A crack in the wall of fear. "What's your name?" Jace asked, gently. The girl blinked once, twice. Then she whispered something too soft for him to hear. "You say it again?" She looked down and said, "Vea." "Vea," he repeated. "My name's Jace." She hesitated again, then whispered, "This ship was ours." Before, Jace felt something tighten in his chest. What happened? Vea glanced at her mother. Then she said, "They hunted us." There was no need to ask who they were. The galaxy was full of powers that saw weakness as crime, survival as rebellion, and family as liability. And aliens like Vea, small, peaceful species without weapons or wealth, were often caught in the teeth of that machine. "Do they know you're here?" Jace asked. She shook her head. "We hid. Mama locked us in the panel behind the fuel tanks. No one checked." His mind reeled. She'd been trapped down there while this ship was parked, sold, and forgotten, and no one noticed. Or cared. Vey, a single quotes SI studied him now, more curious than afraid. "You're human?" "Yeah." "Mama said humans are loud, dangerous, but kind." Jace raised an eyebrow. "All at once?" She nodded. He smiled. "Just a little." Then the ship's comms crackled. He jumped, stepping out and checking the monitor. A scan request was pinging the ship's registry. Someone was checking his docked ship, likely routine. But it wasn't random. The port didn't usually scan derelicts so soon after sail. He shut the comms. Fast. They were already looking. Someone new. He turned back to the hatch. Vea was still there, holding the canteen now, her mother unconscious beside her. Jace felt the weight settle on his shoulders like a storm pressing on old bones. He had a choice. He could turn them in, say it was a mistake, walk away clean. Or he could do what no one else had done for them. "Vea," he said quietly. "How fast can you move?" She blinked up at him. "We need to leave," he said. "Tonight." Outside, the port lights dimmed, a sign that curfew was near. He didn't have a flight plan, didn't have a route or clearance, but he had hands that could fix broken things, and a heart that hadn't stopped breaking since Crid and IV. Maybe this was how he found purpose. Again, not in fixing ships, but in saving lives. Jace worked quickly, sweat forming at the base of his neck despite the cold air inside the freighter. Outside, the port's automated sentry drones drifted in steady circles, blinking red across the landing zone. The ship's systems were barely online, but he had rewired worse before. Still, tonight wasn't about fixing, it was about escaping without being noticed. Down in the hold, Vea sat close to her mother, whose breathing had steadied after Jace gave her a mild stimulant. The woman hadn't woken yet, but the worst had passed. She was alive for now. Vey sat cross-legged, staring at Jace as he knelt to check the power relays beneath the console. Her small voice broke the silence. "Why are you helping us?" Jace paused. He didn't have a clean answer. "Because someone should have," he said finally. Vey tilted her head. "They said humans don't help unless they gain something. And what do you think? Jace asked, not looking up. The girl was. Quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You helped." When no one else did. Her words sank deep into the silence between them. Jace felt something shift inside, like a locked door cracking open. With one last spark of resistance, the engines coughed to life. Not smooth, not clean, but enough. They were ready. "Buckle in," Jace said. "We're flying blind." The ship shuddered as it lifted from the ground. Jace kept her low and slow, hugging the terrain outside the port zone, dodging scanners. He bypassed official traffic lanes, slipped through a forgotten maintenance route that hadn't been updated in years. They were almost clear, but as the freighter cleared the ridge and reached high orbit, a new alarm screamed across the console. Incoming. Transmission. Encrypted. Unauthorized. Jace cursed under his breath. He flicked the comms to listen only. A cold voice spoke. "Not a machine. Not port security. You took something that does not belong to you, human." He didn't answer. "Child, the mother. Return them now, and you'll live." Jace stared at the stars outside the viewport. He recognized that tone. It wasn't a bounty. It wasn't justice. This was a warning from someone used to ownership, to control, and to wiping away whatever didn't bow to them. Vea's voice came. From behind him, shaking. That voice. "They're the ones who came to our world." "Your world?" Jace turned. "You mean your home planet?" She nodded. "We had no soldiers, no weapons. They came with fire. They said we were unregistered, uncounted, unneeded." Jace's stomach twisted. He'd heard stories like this before. Entire species erased in footnotes. He turned off the comms. Then, from the back of the cockpit, a soft groan echoed. Vea's mother was awake. Her eyes fluttered open, sharp, golden, aware. She tried to sit up. Jace reached out to steady her. She pushed his hand away, but not out of hatred, out of habit. Survival taught her not to trust. "You're safe," he said, "for now." The woman looked at Vea, then at Jace. Something in her gaze changed. "You're the human," she whispered. "That's right." Her voice cracked as she said, "No, the one." Jace froze. "What?" "Before they came," she whispered, "our seers told us a shadow would fall, and a starburn would rise. Not one of us, not one of them. Something in between. The one who chooses not for power but for the smallest voice." She pointed to him. "You are not normal." Jace laughed nervously. "You've got the wrong guy. I'm just trying not to get killed." But she didn't laugh. She touched his chest with a trembling finger. "You are not what they expect. And that is why they fear you." Outside, an imperial beacon locked. Onto their ship, they had been marked. Inside the cockpit. The light dimmed, but in that moment, Jace didn't feel small anymore. For the first time in years, he felt necessary. The ship rattled violently as it pushed into deep space, chased by the cold breath of a long-range imperial beacon. Jace's hands gripped the controls, knuckles white, sweat cold on his back. Behind him, Vea and her mother were strapped into the crash seats, silent but wide-eyed. They had no weapons, no shields, and only half a nav map, most of it drawn by hand during Jace's old smuggling days. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had wanted a simple escape, maybe even a clean one. Instead, they were now. Targets. Jace single quotes as breath slowed as he rerouted the last of the auxiliary power into the stealth core, half-functioning prototype he'd picked up from a trader who owed him a favor. It wasn't built for war, but it could mask heat trails. For a while, the stars streaked past them in pale lines. Jace muttered under his breath, trying to stay ahead of the ship trailing them. They hadn't fired yet. They were watching. Waiting. "They want you back alive," Jace said quietly to the mother. She nodded slowly, her face pale, but steady now. Not me, she said. Her. Jace turned to look at Vea. Why? The woman paused, then said, because she remembers. Jace frowned. Remembers what? Everything. Even before the purge. She was there when they came. She heard their voices. She saw the faces of those who gave the orders. Vea looked down, clutching her knees to her chest. They killed. My teacher, she said quietly. He tried to hide the books. Jace's heart ached. Not just at her words, but at how calmly she said them. No child should speak that way. They want to erase us, the mother added. But they didn't. Count on her memory. And you think if she tells someone, she doesn't need to. There are signs, markings, codes spoken only once, hidden things in the language they used. If others hear them from her, it could start a fire they can't control. Jace stared out at the dark. A child with memory strong enough to expose a regime. He had picked up a ghost ship, but what he found was truth. Breathing, scared, but unbroken. Then we can't let them take her, Jace said. A voice from the coms broke the silence. Different from before. Female. Calm. You're far from home, human. This isn't your fight. He didn't respond. Surrender the girl. Walk away? We will not pursue you. Still, he said nothing. The voice turned sharper. If you protect her, you declare yourself an enemy of the order. Vea looked up. Her small voice spoke. They lie. The mother added, they always offer peace, but peace to them means silence. Jace stared at the flickering display. He felt it again, that strange weight in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't duty. It was something more. Ancient. As if the stars themselves leaned in, waiting to see what he'd choose. He activated the manual channel. You want her? He said. There was a pause. Then, yes. Then you'll have to come through me. He shut the COMS. There was no going back now. An alert blinked. 2. Enemy cruisers had entered range. His ship couldn't outrun them forever, but maybe it didn't have to. He reached under the console, opened a rusted panel, and pulled out a small case. Inside were 6 dataships, old, encrypted. From his time with the Resistance, he had burned bridges before, but he'd also saved codes no one knew he still had. He uploaded the first one, an emergency relay that would broadcast a false emergency beacon using a civilian trader frequency. With luck, the enemy would see 1,000 new pings and lose track of the real one. With even more luck, someone out there might hear it. Maybe even someone who still remembered Jace Rowen. He turned to Vea and her mother. You're not cargo. You're not a burden. You're a spark. The girl looked confused. What kind of spark? Jace smiled faintly. The kind that starts fires in dark places. As the enemy ships closed in, Jace throttled the engines and dove toward the asteroid. Field ahead. They wouldn't catch him. Not tonight. Not when hope had taken form beside him. The asteroid field loomed like a silent graveyard. Jagged rocks drifted lazily in space, each one large enough to crush the freighter into scrap. Jace didn't flinch. He knew how to fly through chaos. His hands moved with calm precision, guiding. The ship between shadows where even light dared not follow. Behind him, Vea watched the stars vanish behind stone. Her small hand gripped the back of Jace's seat. Her mother lay in a bunk, recovering, but her strength still hadn't returned. Will they follow us in here? Vea asked softly. Jace nodded. They're not afraid of danger. They're afraid of you. But I'm just a girl, she whispered. Jace glanced back at her. You're more than that, and they know it. The ship rattled as a large rock scraped the side. Metal groaned. Warning lights blinked, but Jace didn't slow. He angled down into a thick cluster where sensors would fail and ships would be forced to rely on instinct. His instinct had been forged in fire, years ago. During the war, he'd pulled a fighter through a storm of burning debris and saved 3 escape pods. He didn't think much of it then, just doing what was right. But some called him a hero. He never believed them. Now, he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying not to let this little girl fall into silence. Then, an alarm. Enemy fighters had entered the field. Not cruisers this time. Smaller, faster, more precise. Hunters. Jace muttered under his breath, flipped 3 switches, and cut the engine's heat output. The ship dimmed, lights dropping into red emergency mode. They'll try to flush us out, he whispered, but they don't know this ship. He stood and opened a floor panel near the cargo bay. Underneath was an old maintenance crawl space, just wide enough to hide 2 people. He turned to Vea. Take your mother. Stay quiet. Don't. Come out until I say. Vea hesitated, her violet eyes full of fear. Jace knelt beside her. I'm not letting them take you, I promise. She nodded, then hurried to wake her mother. Minutes later, the 2 of them disappeared into the hidden space. Jace resealed the hatch, covered it with a crate, and returned to the cockpit. As he powered the systems back up, a voice filled the cabin again. Not over the comms, but inside the ship. A signal. Coded. Resistance level. Encryption. He stared at the console as the message unspooled. Jace Rowen. If you're hearing this, then you've stepped into something dark again. You always did have a way of finding broken stars. He blinked. The voice was familiar. Old. A woman named Erin Vale, once his commander, once his friend. She'd vanished years ago after the fall of the outer colonies. You're not alone. Not if you still have the codes. Activate Channel 9. Where? Watching. Jace felt his heart thump hard in his chest. He keyed the old channel into the system. Nothing happened at first. Then. A ping. A ship responded. Not imperial. Not pirate. A rebel signal. Deep space call sign. Near silent. Watching from beyond the field. Jace opened the link. This is Jace Rowen. I have 2 lives aboard. One of them could break their lives. A pause. Then, transmit location. You're not dying alone today. But as he prepared the coordinates, the enemy ships moved in. One had spotted them. Lasers lit up the dark, rocks shattered around them. Jace dodged wildly, alarm screaming in every direction. The ship was old, slow but still alive. Come on, he growled. You've still got 1 more run in you. He spun between 2 crumbling rocks and fired the decoy flares. 2 of the fighters turned to follow the signal. The 3rd stayed close. Jace jerked the controls. The ship dove into a narrow crevice. Stone scraped metal. Sparks filled the cockpit. His eyes stung, but he didn't blink. He couldn't, because behind him, in the floor, a mother held her child and prayed the human would do the impossible. Again. And Jace Rowen. He would, because in this dark corner of the galaxy, where memory had been hunted and silence was forced upon the weak, he had found something worth protecting. And now, someone was listening. Resistance was no longer a ghost. Had heard a whisper, and was waking up. The ship shook like it was coming apart. Metal screamed. Sparks flew across the panels. Jace gritted his teeth and held the freighter steady as he dove between the sharp walls of the asteroid trench. 1 more shot and the hull might split. The last enemy fighter stayed behind him, close, patient, trained to chase until there was nothing left. Jace wasn't ready to die. Not today. He glanced at the hidden panel below the cargo bay. Vea and her mother were still tucked beneath it, silent. Even through the chaos, he could feel the weight of their presence, the fragile trust they'd placed in him. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a shield. A line between death and a future that refused to be erased. He reached for the emergency relay. Channel 9 was still open. "You better be real," he whispered, "because I'm out of tricks." A pulse returned almost instantly. "We're on your signal. Dropping from phase shroud in 40 seconds. Hold." That was too long. 40 seconds in a dogfight felt like 40 years. A blast shook the rear. Warning. Lights flashed red. Engines losing pressure. The heat vents were failing. If he tried another jump, the core might melt through the hull. But if he slowed, they'd be a perfect target. He looked at the nav scanner, spotted a narrow passage through. 2 jagged boulders. It was suicide. Too tight for his ship. Unless he tilted the ship sideways and killed engine thrust just at the gap. It was madness. He smiled. "All right, old girl," he whispered to the freighter. "Let's fly like you were born to." He angled the ship and leaned hard into the controls. The nose tilted. The engine sputtered. Then silence. He cut thrust completely. For 3 long seconds. They floated. Drifting. Sliding through the tiny gap with nothing but momentum and prayer. The enemy fighter didn't hesitate. But it couldn't fit. The explosion was distant, but violent rock and flame erupted behind them. He didn't even have time to breathe before the console lit up. Visual contact confirmed. "This is the Watcher. We have you, Jace Rowen." Outside the asteroid field, the stars shimmered, and then, like ghosts stepping through mist, 3 sleek black ships appeared. Rebel designs. Quiet engines. No markings. They didn't fire. They simply drifted beside Jace's wounded freighter, shielding it from any further scans. A voice crackled through again. Docking clamp activated. "Prepare for boarding. We're friendly. We're resistance." Jace slumped in the seat, his body trembling with the come down of raw adrenaline. He tapped the internal mic. "Vea. It's safe now." The floor hatch opened gently. Vea's face appeared, pale and tight with fear, but her eyes locked onto his. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would." Behind her, her mother emerged slowly. Her strength had returned, but her posture was still wary. As the resistance crew boarded, weapons lowered, armor dusty from old battles, one of them stepped forward, a tall woman with a scar across her chin. "You're Rowen," she said. "We've heard rumors. Thought you were dead." Jace gave a tired grin. "Almost was twice today." Her eyes shifted to Vea. "And this is the package?" Vea moved closer to her mother, frightened again, but Jace stepped between them, his voice steady. "She's not cargo. She's a witness, a survivor. And maybe the last hope for the truth." The scarred woman nodded slowly. "Then we'll protect her, both of them." As they transferred to the larger ship, Jace helped Vea's mother into the medbay. She paused, touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. Unsure how to respond. She added, "You didn't have to care, but you did. And that's something they can never understand." He watched her disappear into the care of the medics. In the corridor, Vea tugged his sleeve. "Will you stay with us?" Jace hesitated. He had lost everything once, but this felt like the start of something new. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll stay." But before he could rest, a voice came from the bridge. "Rowen, we've got intercepted orders. The Imperials have placed a full bounty on your head, alive only. They want you badly." Jace frowned. "Why?" The resistance commander handed him a datapad. On the screen was his picture. But under it, something new. Not his name. Not his old file. Just a title. "The Witness's Guardian." Jace stared at it. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was now part of something bigger than himself, and they knew it. The resistance ship glided through deep space, its hull marked by battles won in shadows. Jace stood alone in the observation deck, staring out at a field of quiet stars. The universe stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and dark, but somewhere out there, forces were moving. The Imperials weren't done. Not by a long shot. Behind him, the doors slid open with a whisper. Vea entered, her bare feet light against the metal floor. She walked beside him and looked up at the stars, her small face calm. "They're still hunting us," she said softly. "Yes," Jace replied. "Are you afraid?" He hesitated. "I used to be." Vea's hand found his. "But you stayed." Jace looked down at her, heart tightening. "I stayed because it matters." In the following days, the resistance ship jumped between old outposts, quiet moons, and cold listening posts, places no maps remembered. Vea was scanned, gently tested, and then finally allowed to speak in a sealed chamber. What she said stunned even the most hardened. Rebels. She spoke of codes hidden in Imperial orders, of names never written down but spoken once, recorded in her mind. She remembered places erased from history, faces of commanders who led purges but wore no rank. Her memory wasn't just strong, it was perfect. What they carried wasn't just a child, they carried proof. The resistance began spreading encrypted transmissions through underground channels, slowly leaking truth into systems too long fed lies, and everywhere that truth reached, something stirred. Quiet planets began asking questions. Small rebellions found courage, and the name Jace Rowen became a whisper among them. Not as a soldier, not even as a pilot, but as a guardian. The one who stood up when silence had nearly swallowed the galaxy. But truth, as always, came at a cost. A week later, their outpost on Kelpham Minor was hit. The Imperials didn't come asking. They came shooting. Missiles rained from orbit. Shields buckled. Alarms screamed. Jace rushed through fire and metal, grabbing Vajira and Vea by the hand, leading them through smoke-choked corridors toward the evac bay. Soldiers fell, buying them time. As they reached the hangar, another blast tore through the roof. Rubble crashed down, and Jace threw his body over Vey. A single quotes s. Everything went black. He awoke 2 days later. His side was broken. Ribs cracked. Pain flooded every breath. But Vea was alive. And so was Vagyra. The medic said he'd nearly died. Vey never left his side. Not once. When he could finally sit up, she told him quietly, "You were willing to die for us." He smiled through cracked lips. "That's what guardians do." But even in pain, he knew something had changed. Because the attack wasn't just revenge, it was fear. They feared her memory. They feared the idea of someone who couldn't be bought, broken, or silenced. But most of all, they feared the human who protected her. Weeks passed. Their story spread. People began to resist, not just with weapons, but with memory. Truth became the greatest rebellion. And Jace, though scarred and tired, kept going. He fixed ships again, trained others, led missions. Vey grew taller, stronger. Her voice reached more ears, and one day, she stood in front of a crowd of thousands on a moon that once served as an imperial waste ground. Her voice echoed through the air. "I was meant to be forgotten," she said. "But a man with nothing gave me everything: protection, trust, and a chance to speak. And now I say this: they cannot unmake what we remember, and they cannot silence those who stand for others." Jace watched from the crowd, his chest heavy with pride. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a flame, and he, just a man who lit the match. When the speech ended, she walked back to him, not as a frightened child, but as someone born again in defiance. "You still flying with us?" she asked, smiling. Jace looked up at the stars one last time before replying, "Always."